Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marian Werkheiser, and I'm a cultural heritage attorney with the law firm Cultural Heritage Partners. Our firm supports the Coalition for American Heritage, which is an advocacy coalition primarily funded by the Society for Historical Archaeology, the American Cultural Resources Association, the American Anthropological Association, and the Society for American Archaeology. We are here today to discuss the Trump administration's proposed changes to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. We're going to talk about how these changes could impact cultural resources, and these proposed changes would be the first major rewrite of NEPA regulations in more than 40 years. They would drastically alter how the impacts of federal actions are considered. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Kelly Lizarga. She's the advocacy coordinator for Cultural Heritage Partners. And we're gonna have a lot of fun over the next 60 minutes talking about a pretty dense subject. So thanks for hanging in there with us. Today's talk, we're gonna talk about the rulemaking process and how the administration can change the NEPA regulations. We're gonna talk about major concerns that we have with the proposed rule and how you can weigh in if you share our concerns.
We have a really large group here today, so we'll be saving time for questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the question box on your screen to share your thoughts. And we will be recording this webinar, so if you have colleagues who aren't able to attend today but want to watch it later, that will be available to them. So as we jump in, I want to emphasize the most important point in today's webinar is that the proposed changes are not a done deal. Nothing is final yet. We're still in the middle of the rulemaking process, and that's good news. It means that everyone here has a chance to participate and voice their opinions. But the clock has started ticking. From the moment the proposed changes were first published, a timeline was established. So let's walk through where we are now and what happens next.
Great. So this rulemaking started more than a year and a half ago when the administration published an advance notice of rulemaking, and they solicited comments on how NEPA regulations could be improved. The Coalition for American Heritage submitted comments on that notice, urging CEQ not to make wholesale changes to the regulations. But CEQ has, and on January 9th of this year, CEQ announced its proposed changes, which would completely replace the current regulations. The comment period is scheduled to last until March 10th, so you have a month from today to weigh in. Given the scope and the impact of these proposed changes, there was immediate outcry asking for an extension. So the coalition joined with 323 other organizations requesting an extension of the deadline. We've also seen 164 members of Congress sign a letter to CEQ requesting more time to comment. And we also understand that a number of Indian tribes are requesting extensions. But so far, there have been no extensions announced, so we've got a month to go.
Yeah, and that means it's a short window of opportunity in which to make our case. And it's really important to articulate all of our concerns about the possible impacts of the proposed changes during the comment period, because our comments become part of the administrative record for the rulemaking, and CEQ has to respond to the concerns raised during the public comment process.
Right, so once the March deadline passes, the next step is for CEQ to review all of the comments that it receives. The review is a legal mandate. They have to do it. So a failure to consider comments from the general public would be grounds for a court challenge. And folks who would challenge these regulations in court will seek to prove that CEQ did not consider the comments adequately, and thus their decision to adopt the rules was arbitrary and capricious. In addition to seeking public comment, CEQ is required to consult with federally recognized Indian tribes. And we understand that a number of tribes are raising concerns that CEQ is not conducting formal government-to-government consultation as required by law and executive orders. So if CEQ fails to meaningfully consult the tribes, then that would also be grounds for a court challenge.
And now, after reviewing and responding to all of the comments, CEQ may make changes to its proposed rule. Once they have a final draft, they'll submit it to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, it's a long title, which reviews the quality of the cost-benefit analysis and ensures that the rule is consistent with the president's policy preferences. Once that office gives its approval, the final rule is published in the Federal Register, and it goes into effect no fewer than 30 days after publication. Now, it's clear that the administration hopes to finalize the new NEPA regulations this year in case the president isn't reelected. The more comments the government receives, the longer it will likely take for CEQ to review those comments. And if CEQ rushes this process, then it may leave itself more vulnerable to litigation once the rule is finalized.
So in this case, I don't think it's much of a question whether OIRA is going to say that the proposed NEPA changes are in line with President Trump's preferences. These changes are a natural extension of the administration's priority on deregulation. So throughout his campaign and during his time in office, the president has railed against government regulations as impediments to business and infrastructure development, and has pledged to use his office to make drastic cuts to the number of existing regulations. Cutting red tape is exactly the picture of his presidency that he wants to promote.
Yeah.
So if these proposed rules are finalized as written, every agency will have 12 months to promulgate revised NEPA regulations consistent with the new CEQ regs, and all existing CEQ guidance on NEPA will be nullified. The proposed rule is also consistent with the priorities of major industry groups promoting oil and gas exploration, mining, mineral development. Major industry leaders are banding together and pledging to spend millions of dollars in lobbying in support of these regulatory changes. For example, the Chamber of Commerce has convened a coalition of more than 30 oil and gas, wind energy, and farming trade associations like the Edison Electric Institute, API, American Farm Bureau Federation, National Association of Home Builders, to support these changes. Another coalition has promised to spend $5 million at least on public-facing messaging designed to support the new rules, with a message that environmental review is the reason why new infrastructure takes so long to be built.
However, we are also hearing notes of caution. For example, there's a group of institutional investors representing $113 billion in assets, and they urged companies not to take advantage of Trump administration rollbacks of environmental regulations, because in their letter, they warned that the companies and their investors could be at, quote, significant risk of public backlash and stranded assets should these actions be legally challenged or protections be restored by the courts or by future administrations.
So Kelly, why was NEPA passed in the first place?
Let's talk about what it's designed to do. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, there was increasing concern about the impact that people were having on the environment. And in response to this public outcry, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act, signed into law by President Nixon in 1970. So Congress enacted NEPA to establish a lasting environmental policy to protect the human environment from impacts inflicted by federally funded, permitted, and approved projects. It really is the cornerstone of all environmental policy in the United States. And NEPA was enacted to ensure that the public and stakeholders could provide input on major federal decisions before projects began. Maybe you could share a little bit more about what NEPA does.
So NEPA requires agencies to review projects for potential harmful effects to the environment before a decision is made to begin a project. NEPA was designed to allow the public, and in particular the interested stakeholders, to know the details of the project and provide input to assist the government in making an informed decision. NEPA mandates that federal agencies assess proposed federal actions' environmental impacts, including impacts on historic and cultural resources. Federal agencies meet their NEPA review responsibilities by completing the NEPA processes set forth in the NEPA regulations. And there's 3 forms of NEPA review. And I apologize for all you NEPA experts, but I think it's important just to hit these really quickly. There's categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. So CEs, categorical exclusions, are for projects that are not going to have a significant impact on the environment, and they will not require preparation of an EA or an EIS. Federal agencies each develop a list of actions that can be processed as a CE, and these lists are created through agency rulemaking, so people have a chance to comment on them. Some examples of CEs could include stripping a road, maintenance of trails throughout a national park, or changing the light bulbs in a federal building to LEDs. The next step up is environmental assessments, and those apply when an agency is unsure whether a particular action will have significant impacts on the human environment. So in the case of an EA, the federal agency will create a concise evaluation of potential effects. If the study finds that there will be no significant impacts, the agency will issue a finding of no significant impact, or a FONSI. If the EA finds that there are significant impacts, then the agency has to prepare an EIS. So an environmental impact statement is the most detailed and comprehensive review under NEPA. An EIS is prepared if the proposed action would significantly impact the quality of the human environment. There are several steps to producing an EIS, including a notice of intent. There is an alternatives analysis that's involved, and public involvement is a really important element of these analyses. The results are published in a draft EIS, and then the public and resource agencies get a chance to comment on that. And then finally, the agency will prepare a final EIS, which presents the selected project alternative and discusses any mitigation measures that will need to be implemented as a result of the alternative selection. The process concludes when the agency publishes the explanation for its decision in a record of decision, or a ROD. And that ROD includes agency commitments to mitigate adverse impacts resulting from the selected project alternative.
And can you explain how NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act work together?
So it's really important to remember that NEPA is separate from the National Historic Preservation Act in Section 106. So while both NEPA and Section 106 consider effects on historic properties, federal agencies have independent legal requirements under NEPA and Section 106. As the ACHP noted in their NEPA Section 106 handbook, distinctions exist between the NEPA and the Section 106 reviews in terms of the types, scope, and geographical area of environmental review procedures, the nature of public engagement and tribal consultation, information requirements, procedures for developing alternatives, documentation, and timing. So why do we care about changes to NEPA if Section 106 is still going to apply and isn't changing? And that's the question that I've gotten most frequently since these new rules came out. The chief reason that folks who care about preserving historic places should care about NEPA is because the NEPA process is designed to identify alternatives to a proposed action that may have fewer effects on the environment, including to historic resources. As that same ACHP handbook notes, in practice, the preferred alternative in a NEPA review may be considered equivalent to the proposed undertaking in Section 106. So if NEPA is changed so that fewer projects are subject to a robust analysis of alternatives, we would lose a valuable tool for avoiding impacts to historic and cultural resources. And unfortunately, some of the changes in the proposed regulations would do just that.
Let's talk specifically about some of those proposed changes. Overall, the new regulations would give agencies much more discretion to determine whether NEPA review is required for a particular project at all, and which effects will be considered. And the new regulations will reduce the ability for the public to have input on those decisions.
Right. So CEQ proposes changes to how agencies would determine whether NEPA applies at all. And so let's talk first of all about this new threshold applicability analysis. It gives us a definition of major federal action that would limit the number of projects that even go to NEPA review. The proposed regulations state that a major federal action, a defined term, does not include non-federal projects with minimal federal funding or minimal federal involvement where the agency cannot control the outcome of the project. Now, this definition raises the bar on what types of projects an agency may consider, and will mean that some projects that are subject to NEPA review now will not be subject to NEPA after these new rules are finalized. It's also worth noting that neither minimal nor control is further defined, and that phrase is entirely new in the NEPA realm. There are not yet examples for what types of projects would or would not meet that threshold. CEQ invites comments on whether a percentage of federal funding should be adopted as a test, but the most likely way that this will sort itself out is through litigation. Yeah. The redefinition is part of a threshold analysis introduced in these new regulations which allows agencies to decide, either through their own regulations or on a case-by-case basis, whether projects should be subject to NEPA.
Mm-hmm.
Agencies may decide that a project should not comply with NEPA because it is not of major federal action, because the agency determines it would conflict with another law, or because the agency determines another process or statute will cover any concerns raised by stakeholders. This is really different than the CEs currently in place. So right now, CEs must go through a rulemaking process, as I was mentioning, meaning that the public has a chance to comment on them before they go into effect. Furthermore, agencies that seek to take advantage of a CE still have to consider whether extraordinary circumstances, which could include impacts on cultural resources, require a more robust NEPA review. With this new rule, an agency can unilaterally decide that a certain project does not have to be subject to NEPA at all, and no further analysis would be required, and no advanced rulemaking would have been required. So this change gives the agency a huge amount of discretion as to whether NEPA applies at all.
Mm-hmm.
Should I keep going?
Yeah, let's talk about the definition of effects.
Yeah, this has gotten a lot of attention in the media. So under the new rule, the definition of effects that have to be considered under NEPA would change. Currently, the regulations distinguish between direct, indirect, and cumulative effects. The new regulations would eliminate those distinctions and instead say that effects must be reasonably foreseeable and have a reasonably close causal relationship to the proposed action or alternatives. They say a but-for causal relationship is insufficient to make an agency responsible for a particular effect under NEPA. So this is a change in position. And what it means is that CEQ is saying that an analysis of cumulative effects is not required under NEPA at all. Instead, they say that agencies should focus their efforts on analyzing effects that are most likely to be potentially significant and be effects that would occur as a result of the agency's decision. Agencies are not expected to conduct exhaustive research on identifying and categorizing actions beyond the agency's control. With this proposed change and the proposed elimination of the definition of cumulative impacts, CEQ wants to focus the analysis of effects on reasonably foreseeable effects from the proposed action. That is not defined in the regs. So they also say that the effects should not be considered significant if they are remote in time, geographically remote, or the result of a lengthy causal chain. So we are concerned that eliminating consideration of cumulative effects, and CEQ is considering the possible elimination of indirect effects, that ignores a wide array of community concerns about these projects, and that could lead to weaker alternatives analysis. And in addition to leading to a weaker alternatives analysis, CEQ is specifically asking for public comment on whether they should establish a maximum number of alternatives, like 3 alternatives. We would oppose this change because it could arbitrarily limit agency consideration of alternatives that could avoid or minimize impacts to historic and cultural resources.
And the proposed regulation also limits the time, scope, and analysis process of environmental assessments and environmental impact statements to 2 years.
1 year for EAs and 2 for EIS.
Thank you. Yes, often meaningful consultation with stakeholders and tribes takes time, and arbitrary time limits mean that agencies will be tempted to skip or shortchange steps in the process. We've already seen this type of time limit create issues, especially for cultural resources. Agencies will be tempted to skip steps in the Section 106 process because Section 106 also has to be finished before a project can be authorized to proceed. For example, we've heard that BLM has recently tried to enforce a 1-year limit on EAs and EISs, and it's resulted in creating Section 106 programmatic agreements that punt major decisions about effects on historic properties until years later, after the project's already been permitted. Now, we should note that this doesn't mean NEPA analyses can't be done in 1 or 2 years. That's quite possible, and in fact, the Forest Service has recently altered their process to include stakeholders as early as possible and to include them in the design of the plan. And through this early consultation, Forest Service has been able to complete NEPA quickly, sometimes in under a year. However, the way to ensure that NEPA analyses are done quickly is to encourage better planning, not by imposing arbitrary timelines.
That's right. Let me talk about one more change before we get into how you can comment. Another change that we're very concerned about is the change of the definition of significantly. So remember, a major tenet of NEPA is to assess whether a major federal action significantly affects the human environment. Under the current rule, if there's a significant impact, the agency then prepares an EIS. But the proposed new rules don't define significantly, but in a separate portion of the regulation, CEQ outlines some considerations that seem to derive from the original definition. And on our slides, I've put the two sections side by side. I will not read them to you, but it's important to know that the regulations have gone from listing 10 considerations to 3. The regulations eliminate the reference to unique resources, including cultural ones, and actually eliminate the description of significantly entirely from the definition section. So this not only puts at risk the types of resources we discussed earlier, but it creates a whole host of questions on interpretation. So can agencies still take those other resources into account? Are those resources specifically excluded from the new list? Are they encompassed by the other ones that are listed? I think those kinds of questions are going to end up in litigation if this rule is finalized as written.
Yeah, it's striking how much shorter they are. Yeah, and you know, when I think about NEPA, really, the major tenet of NEPA is about public involvement, right? The chance for the community members to comment on the potential impacts of a project. And this new rule would limit the ability of the public to make those comments. For example, it would only allow public comment on the completeness of the review rather than the purpose and the need of the project. And those arbitrary timelines that I talked about for EAs and EISs will likely mean reduced opportunities for public comment. Objections to proposed alternatives would have to be made within 30 days of the notice of availability of the EIS, or they'd be waived. In addition, the new rule would ban groups who did not publicly comment on the rule from pursuing litigation in court. It also encourages the use of bonds in court cases, where those seeking to bring a claim would have to put up money to get access to the court system. And really, as a general matter, these regulations are bound to result in just extensive litigation, right? Which in turn results in further project delays.
Yeah, NEPA has 50 years worth of case law that interprets the statute and its regulations. All of this case law helps agencies and in turn applicants and community stakeholders determine guardrails for project reviews. These new regulations would toss all of that case law and all of the existing CEQ guidance away. So the predictability that comes with 50 years worth of guidance and case law would be gone. And the inevitable result will be to litigate all of these differences between the current rule and the new rule. So this negative impact isn't limited to environmental advocacy groups, and I think this is important. Industry groups and developers are going to lose that predictability as well. And they're going to lose the ability to rely on the public input process to surface and resolve concerns about the project if public involvement is limited.
Yeah, now, and we have pointed out a lot of problems or a lot of concerns, but before we wrap up, I do want to mention one noteworthy positive change in these proposed regulations.
There's one.
Yeah, throughout these new regulations, the word tribal is added to the phrase state and local, making sure that tribes are getting a heightened status within NEPA equivalent to that of state and local governments. So this change formalizes a responsibility to consult with tribes in the NEPA framework.
Yeah. So those are the high points of the changes. There's a whole bunch more, and the coalition will be preparing really detailed comments about all of the changes, but we just wanted to give you the high notes today. And now we want to talk about what you can do if you share our concerns.
Yes, so you can participate in the public comment process from now until March 10th. We have a sample comment letter in our webinar materials and the handouts. Please feel free to use it as a jumping off point for your own efforts. And we've got suggestions on where you can really personalize it to your own experience. But here's some general suggestions about writing a good letter. what we really want to do is make your letter something that the agency really has to take into account. And they do place a higher value on facts and new information versus opinions without supporting data. So please don't hesitate to express your opinion, but back it up with a personal anecdote with statistics or figures from your own business, your own experience that'll bolster your case. However, that being said, even very basic letters without supporting data can have an effect if they arrive in large enough numbers, and that's what we're really hoping for. A flood of public comments makes an unmistakable impact, even if the administration tries to downplay it. It's easier for an agency to disregard a bunch of form letters, but they still have to be counted, and a large number draws significant attention. I've got an example up here about what happened when President Trump was talking about shrinking the national monuments, and the news story became this flood of letters, 2.8 million public comment letters, and the news media devoted a lot of attention to the high level of interest. So, recognize there's going to be a lot of spin involved, public participation's open to interpretation, and the administration is going to see it through a political lens. Lots of comments are good when they support the administration, but they're just spam and form letters if the public disagrees with the administration. In no way should that discourage you from participating, because large public outcries really put the administration on notice that the public is watching carefully.
Yeah, so let's talk about 5 things that you need to know about writing a great comment letter. First one is you've got to get the details right. So you got to check the dates for the open period. In this case, you have to submit your comments no later than March 10th.
Right.
If there is a change to that, if we actually do get an extension, we'll send out an update to you. But right now, March 10th, put it on your calendar. You're going to want to clearly identify which rule you're commenting on and include the docket number. And it's okay to just comment on one part of the rule.
Right, because this thing is huge.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're going to want to introduce yourself and your business. So if it's relevant, include details like the size, location, services of your business. You're only required to include your name, city, state, and country. But everything that you say will be part of the public record. So don't put anything in there that you don't want everybody to be able to see. You want to state your position. So you want to state whether you're supporting or opposing these rules and say how you think the agency should proceed. And you need specific information about how you think it's going to affect your work, your business. I think that including in this case, many of you will have to retrain your staff on these new rules, which will be more staff hours.
Significant cost for you.
Yeah, it will be a big cost for you. Yeah.
And then you also want to do anything you can to suggest alternatives. If you see a suggestion of how to make this better, go ahead and put that forth. And if you think that they should just scrap the whole proposed rule and start over, you can say that too.
That's right. So let's talk about how to actually submit them. So regulations.gov is your website where you can submit them as an attachment in Word or PDF. And if you do it that way, you'll receive a tracking number so you can review your comments after the agency has posted them. And we really recommend this as the best way. Agencies will still take emails to the address in the Federal Register and mailed letters, but going through the portal is the best way to go.
Yeah. And then you can read other people's comments as well. And, fingers crossed, there's a lot of interest in these changes, and we want to see a lot of people submitting their opinions. And really, we're just hoping that a flood of letters supporting stronger protections for cultural resources will convince CEQ not to proceed with these proposed changes, because this comment period is really our best shot at maintaining these important protections for cultural resources.
But if CEQ proceeds as planned, you gotta have a backup plan, is at the end. And is there anything that we can do to stop these changes? The courts and Congress also play a role. So rules can be challenged in court, and we've talked about that, because agencies relied on the wrong evidence or failed to acknowledge public comments or failed to give adequate notice to the public. So typically the government wins about 69% of the time in cases involving a challenge to agency action. But this administration has had a far less successful experience in the court.
Yeah.
So more than 90% of the Trump administration's deregulatory efforts have been blocked in court or withdrawn after a lawsuit. And that's according to a running tally maintained by the Institute for Policy Integrity, which is a nonpartisan think tank. In many cases, courts have said that the administration's actions were not justified because they failed to solicit public input before taking an action, or because they took an action that was arbitrary and capricious.
And it's fair to assume that any big changes to NEPA will be challenged in court. And given the administration's low rate of success with such challenges, these changes may be invalidated. But the other possible recourse is in Congress. The Congressional Review Act gives Congress 60 legislative days, that's days when Congress is actually in session, to overturn federal rulemakings with a simple majority vote. Most importantly, if a federal rule is invalidated under the Congressional Review Act, future administrations are barred from creating a new rule that's substantially similar to the one that was disapproved. So for the rest of time, agencies would be limited if they try to create new regulations on the same subject.
That's what happened to the BLM planning rule when this new Congress came in that we worked a lot on. So.
Right, but you know, things have to line up perfectly for this to even be a possibility, because while the Congressional Review Act requires only a bare majority in both chambers of Congress, meaning we don't have to worry about a Senate filibuster, it does require the signature of the president. So it's hard to imagine this happening if President Trump is reelected. A more likely scenario is for a Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate to try and overturn new NEPA regulations. And that depends on Democrats sweeping the elections in November. There's no crystal ball here. We can't predict the election results. So we're going to just consider that a possibility and use this time to educate members of Congress about our concerns.
Yeah. So each one of you can contact your congressional delegation and express your opposition to these changes. We suggest drafting one email that you can send to all 3 members of Congress, and we're going to have a template for you that you can use. A number of members of Congress have already expressed concerns about these changes, and they need to hear that their constituents care as well. So in your message, you're going to want to include your name and address so they know that you're a voter. And it's helpful to explain what your stake is in the issue. You know, are you a professional working on NEPA projects? Are you a member of a historic preservation organization? And then you want to identify which parts of the proposed changes are most concerning to you and why. This is a huge topic. We could talk for hours, and we've been talking really fast to try to fit it all in. But it's perfectly acceptable to concentrate on only small sections about which you are most concerned. And explain how these changes are going to impact your work and your community. It's also a good chance to practice recycling. You can kind of copy and paste your CEQ comment letter and send that on to your members of Congress.
Yes. And once your message is ready, you can submit it via our website, heritagecoalition.com.
.org. Yeah.
I'm sorry. And it will automatically send the email to your representatives, or you can visit the web pages of each member who represents you. You know, check on their website for something that says share your opinion or contact me. Click on that. Most of them have forms that come up, and you can just paste your text into their website. If you're not sure who represents you, go to govtrack.us, type in your address. Maybe you've been redistricted or something. And they also have direct links to the websites of your members. So if you can do that, if you can write a statement about why you oppose these changes, send it to CEQ, send it to Congress, really your actions will benefit cultural resource management throughout the country. And we really thank you for taking the time to learn more about how you can voice your opinion and how you can help, because this issue is so vital. NEPA, really, like the National Historic Preservation Act, enshrined into law the opportunity for all Americans to have a voice in the federal government's development decisions. And it's just really important to protect that. Of course, the other big opportunity to express your voice comes this November with your vote, and this spring in the primaries. So please make sure that you're registered to vote. You can visit vote.org. That's a nonpartisan site that can get you registered if you aren't yet, that can check your registration, help you request an absentee ballot, and much more.
Whew. All right, that was quick. So Now we'd love to take some of your questions. You can type them in the question box, and I'm going to pull it up here and see what we've got. Let's see. We did have questions about whether this will be circulated later, and it will. We've recorded this. We're also going to have resources up on the Heritage Coalition website, so you can look there. And especially if you've had trouble with some of the audio, you can check that out and get the quick and dirty.
And there are handouts on this webinar, a sample letter to CEQ and a sample letter to Congress that you can use that just sort of plug in your own particular information or your own examples.
I think we have to give people a couple minutes to type them in. Yeah. Maybe we answered them all. I seriously doubt it though. One thing I wanted to remind everybody is that in the rule it says literally every federal agency will have to replace their current NEPA regulations within 12 months. So it's good to get in the habit of commenting on these now, because we're going to have a flood of agencies who are going to be making these decisions and trying to harmonize their regulations with this new approach. So everything's going to move really quickly once these rules are finalized. Let's see. Oh yeah. So here's a great question. Someone asks, I realize that NEPA regs are separate from state regulations, but many states base their environmental protection policies on NEPA. If these regs change, would you care to speculate on the effect on state regulations? It could be messy for a long time. You could end up with states where there's a higher bar for state environmental reviews than federal environmental reviews. And that would mean that for folks who want to ensure that these analyses continue to be robust, you need to be advocating at the state level as well, so that if you do have a higher standard, you can maintain it. And vice versa. Some states have not put in place stronger environmental protections because they think that the federal government will cover it. And if that's not the case anymore, there could be a flurry of action at the state level. That's a great question. Let's see. Could you repeat the period of time subject to the Congressional Review Act?
60 legislative days. So that's not 60 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's 60 days when the House and the Senate are in session. So those are counted very differently. You know, they might be in session 3 or 4 days 1 week and then go out of session for 2 weeks. So I can't give you a hard month and date.
One of the questions, could you please provide an example or expand on how these changes could impact cultural resources review, assuming no changes to 106 are made and that it is still running somewhat, at least more or less concurrently with NEPA? There's been a lot of effort within government agencies to try to sync up the Section 106 and NEPA processes so that we're not duplicating effort, and one process can inform the other even though they are separate legal responsibilities by the agency. So what we typically see now in good practice is that the Section 106 review and NEPA will start at the same time. And the information that's being gathered for the 106 review will inform the alternatives analysis that's conducted under NEPA. And what I am most concerned about for cultural resources is that these proposed changes will mean much weaker alternatives analysis if we get them at all. I'm concerned that a lot of projects will never have to undergo an alternatives analysis. The ones that do, they'll be arbitrarily limited, and we will not be considering a lot of the effects that we've been considering up until now. And so what that means is you lose an opportunity to choose a better alternative that would have fewer impacts on historic and cultural resources because it's never even considered. And so that's a major tool that we have right now to try to protect these resources that would go away. And then Section 106 would have to pick up and help to resolve those effects. And so That's the part that really concerns me as somebody who wants to see more cultural resources preserved. I'm also frankly concerned about the reduction in public involvement and the chance that we could lose a lot of really important information because the public input will be so constrained under NEPA. So I think that that's the main takeaway. Let's see. What's the anticipated effect of the change in regulation on NEPA projects that are currently ongoing? Would the new rules supplant existing regulations, or would existing regulations be grandfathered? That's a little up in the air. The rule itself said that that the new regulations would apply for all projects going forward, and at the agency's discretion, they can apply these new rules. So you'll have to see how different agencies tackle the problem of projects that have already been in process for a long time. And that could be another really sticky area where it injects a lot of unpredictability for developers, for communities, for tribes. So we'll be watching that pretty carefully. And that's something that we would love to hear from you. If you are working on a project and you're hearing that the agencies are making decisions on that, we'd love to hear what's going on so that we can be reporting to folks on the Hill and in the agencies how other people are handling that.
And while Marion's looking at the questions, let me just ask everyone, if you'd like to stay informed about this, if you want to keep hearing more, please go to our website, heritagecoalition.org. If you haven't already, click on Join the Coalition. You can join as an individual. That'll get you on the email list so that you get our regular newsletters, like us on Facebook, because we'll continue posting updates and more information about comment periods in the future.
We got lots of questions now. One question, if agencies are given the choice not to do NEPA, do you see an uptick in agencies having a more robust Section 106 plan? I don't know. I think that will be up to you. It will be up to advocacy from our community as to whether agencies feel like they have to improve Section 106 review to compensate for the loss. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. Let's see. Somebody asked if there are positive things that you could comment on in the new rules. I think everyone has acknowledged that in some limited cases, NEPA review has taken way too long. And we made that point in our coalition comments on the first round of public comments when CEQ asked for input on how they could improve NEPA. And we talked a lot about how we would love to see more efficient review processes and see NEPA documents that are much more publicly accessible so that people can understand in plain English what they mean and be able to comment better. But study after study that the federal government has conducted has showed that NEPA is not the cause of delays. It's not the NEPA requirements that are holding up projects, even though a lot of developers like to blame NEPA for holds up. The challenges have been in implementation, and so we've been advocating for better practice, for better training, for better guidance, so that we can get more efficiencies out of the NEPA process. But we've argued that a wholesale replacement is really not needed. If you see some more positive things in the regulations, such as the inclusion of tribal, by all means, put that in your comment letter. We want to encourage good things, but here we've touched on the positive ones that we see.
Yeah.
Let's see, what other ones? We have a question. What are other weaknesses in the current NEPA regulations that we have an opportunity to provide feedback on now? Right now, the opportunity to comment on the current regulations and how they should be changed has kind of passed. So what we need to focus our comments on right now are these new regulations, and what we see are the problems with those. So you want to not confuse the two for purposes of this comment period. Let's see. We had a question about how the administration responded to the number of comments on the advance notice. So that was the thing that happened 18 months ago. They said they had 12,500 comments, and in the new rule, they repeatedly reference the commenters and talk about how, you know, commenters asked for blah, 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 but they don't really specify exactly who made those comments and how many people made those comments. And the question is that consistent with the Administrative Procedure Act? So the way that that these comments would be challenged in court is under the Administrative Procedure Act, and that will look at whether the agency had reliable information, whether they considered all the information that was provided to them, and whether their decision was reasonable or whether it was arbitrary and capricious. And so I think that the agencies, I was very frustrated when I was reading the rule about how vague they were about which commenters asked for which thing. And I do think that would be an interesting area to surface when the final rule is challenged. And it goes to the point of the importance of having a number of commenters who are speaking about the same concerns, because it's much harder to dismiss 10 commenters than 1,000 who are talking about the exact same issue. And it will require the government to make a more full-throated description of how they either accepted or rejected that claim. Let's see. What effect will these changes have on meaningful consultation with tribal groups for projects? So there is a positive change in that tribal has been added to the regulations, so that now it's very clear that the agencies have to consult with tribes at each stage of this process. However, because this rule would give the agencies so much discretion to narrow the projects that are actually subject to NEPA, tribes will lose an opportunity to weigh in, just like other members of the public will, if there's no NEPA process at all. And so that's a major concern that I think a lot of tribes should have. And these other issues around how many alternatives, which effects are going to be considered. I would think that tribes would have a lot of strong views about those questions. But there's still very much a legal obligation to consult with tribes on every NEPA review. I'm just worried there's not going to be as many NEPA reviews
to begin with.
Yeah. Let's see. One more. As someone who makes their living from Section 106 and NEPA work, I'm interested in how much work do you think will be lost due to these changes? I cannot estimate, but there will be work lost. And I think it's important that in your comments, you talk about that and talk about the impact that it could have on your business. You know, and the earlier question about whether state regulations will pick up the slack, that's a really good one. And that may impact the end of the day answer on how much work will go away because of this. But I think it's very important that those of you who are earning your living doing this type of work point out that there's other consequences besides just the you know, the loss of resources that may not be considered because of this. It's also a loss of information that you gather in your work every day and the public value that your work creates.
Right. And if you see unintended consequences of any part of these changes, that's certainly something to address in your letter.
The question, are these proposed changes being driven by a specific region and/or industry? We'll post on our website some of the news coverage of the coalitions that are forming to support these changes, but it is across the board, representatives from the oil and gas industry, from mining industry, from home builders, from transportation developers. It's folks who want to be able to get projects done more quickly. And what I think they don't realize is that this change will actually have the opposite effect for them. It will mean that they have lost the predictability that they had. It will mean there will be more public, I would predict that there will be more public outcry that they will have to deal with because federal agencies won't be dealing with it. And the litigation of the new rule will certainly delay a number of projects. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that while the administration is trying to do a favor for those groups, this isn't going to get them what they want. Yeah. Let's see. What is the best way to establish that the proposed NEPA regulation changes are arbitrary and capricious and should be rejected by a court? The best way is to submit really good comments. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
The more that you can give real examples of how these changes would impact your work, real examples where the current regulations have led to positive outcomes, and those outcomes would be different under these regulations. And any studies that you're aware of, any data that you can provide that will force the agency to have to consider that. And if they don't, then they are at risk of being found to have made an arbitrary decision. So it's really up to us to provide that information to the agency so that when a judge looks at the record, that judge can decide whether the agency made a reasonable decision. See if there's any more. We're almost out of time. I think those are the main questions that seem to affect everyone. There are a couple of questions about whether it's even worth it in this political environment to advocate like this. And I know a lot of us are really tired, and this is just the beginning this is the middle of the beginning of the NEPA changes. But there's a real chance to make a difference here. Your comments will make a difference. They will inform judges. Your outreach to your members of Congress will get them interested in this issue, will educate them about your concerns, make them more likely to be helpful down the road when they can be. And your votes will have the biggest impact on what happens with this policy. So don't become complacent and try and tune this stuff out. This is a big deal. It's really important for preservation. It's really important for professionals who work in this field, and we all really need to be engaged on it. Do you want to add anything?
You know, members of Congress are going to be in full-fledged campaign season. And so if you do have the opportunity, if you're out at a public event, if you run into your member of Congress in the airport, we've seen these things happen. You know, don't be shy about raising your hand, asking a question. You know, where does your member stand? You don't have to be confrontational. You don't have to be angry. But even in asking your question, have you been following the proposed changes to NEPA? What do you think of them? It's putting that issue on their radar screen. It's letting them know that people in your community care about this. And then if you can follow up, or if you can send your letter and share examples of how that impacts your work, how that impacts your business, it really humanizes the issue. And I think that at this point, you know, there are a lot of environmental groups who are really engaged on this topic. Probably a lot of members of Congress, a lot of the media hasn't heard so much from people who are viewing it through this historic resources lens. And so we need to be really engaged, and we need to really get that perspective out there.
I think that's right. Yeah. And we're here to help. We put up our contact information on the webinar screen. You can go to our website, get templates there. You can also email us. If there are questions that you've had that we didn't get a chance to answer today, feel free to reach out by email or phone call, and we'll do our best to answer your concerns. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and we'll be following up with you. Thank you.